My name is Michael Stroh, and my project is titled Supporting Mojave Desert Tortoise Recovery Through Strategic Raven Management.
Yes.
Just a little overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to give a little background on my partner organization. I'm going to kind of introduce the conservation issue that I was addressing and then give some more context to that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my early deliverables, this reporting template, some maps, and then in the second half, talk about the interviews I conducted, the kind of final report that I generated out of that, and then a proposed management framework. So just a little background on my partner organization. I partnered up with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Utah Ecological Services Field Office. Ecological Services is a fish and wildlife service program. There are offices in every state. The one in Utah is in Salt Lake area. Colorado has 2 of these offices. And the role that these offices serve is to kind of mitigate conflict between development interests and sensitive fish and wildlife and their habitat. And so they provide biological advice to different government agencies, developers, private citizens on how their development activities might impact sensitive species. They administer the Endangered Species Act, so they really specialize in those threatened species. And these offices are staffed by biologists who kind of have a caseload of species that they work with. And so I worked really closely with a biologist named Danielle Costantini. And the desert tortoise is one of the species that she specializes in. And just to kind of introduce the conservation issue so you can see where I'm going as I provide more context. The issue that we're looking to address is that common ravens are preying on juvenile Mojave desert tortoises at a rate that is unsustainable. And we early on identified this project need to develop a long-term raven management strategy. But to really understand that, I kind of have to give some more context, and I'll go back about 35 years. The Mojave desert tortoise is considered a keystone species, which means that it plays a really important part in its ecosystem and is important to other species. Some examples of that, Mojave desert tortoises spend about 90% of their time in underground burrows, but other wildlife utilize those burrows as well. The tortoise is really important for seed dispersal, and they're also a prey species for other animals. And tortoise populations have been in the decline, and the data on this is really patchy before 1990. But there was enough evidence at that time to justify listing it as a threatened species in 1990. After its listing, a lot more resources went into studying its decline. And so a more recent statistic is between 2004 and 2014, there was a 37% decrease in desert tortoises range-wide. And mind you, that's after it's been listed. Shortly after its listing, its range was broken into these 5 recovery units. You can also kind of see its range in California, Nevada, a little bit in Arizona, and Southwest Utah. The recovery unit that I was working in is the Upper Virgin River Recovery Unit. It is the smallest recovery unit, but it also currently has the highest density of desert tortoises. In 2013, it was estimated that there are about 18.3 tortoises per square kilometer. And for comparison, the next densest area is about half that. So this is a really critical area. Zooming in on Southwest Utah, I was working in Washington County. If you're not familiar with Washington County, Washington County is where Zion National Park is. Some cities you might recognize the name of is St. George and Hurricane. Those are the biggest residential areas. And on this map overlaid is the desert tortoises range, so it really covers a big percentage of the county. And in the 1990s, when the tortoise was listed, this was a time when areas like St. George were really rapidly growing. And the ESA listing put these new restrictions on development that really restricted the ability of the county to grow. And so that conflict kind of necessitated the creation of the Washington County Habitat Conservation Plan. And a habitat conservation plan is basically a voluntary agreement between the county and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the county is responsible for mitigating negative effects to the desert tortoise, but it also frees them up to develop a little more freely. And so really the biggest outcome from this agreement was the creation of Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, which protects over 60,000 acres of really critical habitat for the Mojave Desert Tortoise. And so the agreement here is this area is highly protected, but outside of this area, the county has a lot more freedom to develop. And so with that conflict being kind of the root of the creation of the HCP, the desert tortoise has just been very controversial in this area ever since its ESA listing. A lot of people in the county view the listing as just a way for the government to overreach, exercise control on local government. Whereas other people really would credit the desert tortoise for kind of having saved the county from just being completely developed. A lot of people use the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve as a recreation area. And so there are a lot of different opinions, and the desert tortoise is particularly controversial right now. I could spend my entire presentation talking about this, but I'll just give you the bullets. Basically, the county wants to build a section of highway that goes through this very bottom section of the reserve to ease traffic and as the county grows. And so the Trump era federal government in 2021 initially approved the creation of the highway, which triggered a bunch of lawsuits from environmental groups. And so the federal government at that time kind of walked back their decision to reevaluate, and they found some issues with their initial environmental impact research. And so, which further divided the federal government and the county, created more conflict. And actually, as I was practicing this presentation yesterday, more news came out, and the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they are not going to allow the highway to be built. The reason they have control over that is that section of the reserve is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. They're saying you can't build on federal land here. And so this headline kind of displays some of the tension between the county and the federal government. I think it's safe to say everyone in this county has an opinion with this highway. And so this isn't directly related to the ravens, but all of this is centered on the tortoise. Everyone is saying that they're acting in the best interest of the tortoise, and these groups have to work together to do the raven work as well. So it's created tension. Jumping back more to the ecological side, talk a bit more about ravens. A primary threat to the Mojave Desert tortoise is excessive predation from common ravens. This is especially an issue with the juveniles. Until they're about 10 years old, they're really vulnerable to ravens because they're small and their shell is soft. And so when this happens at a high rate, it creates these gaps in the tortoise populations, or in the demographics of the populations, and that's contributing to the decline in populations. But I think it's also important to say that ravens are also native to the Mojave Desert. They are not an invasive species. They also have legal protections under the Migratory Birds Treaty Act, that's international law. But raven populations have really grown range-wide, which has made this problem worse. And the reason that they've these populations have grown so exponentially is really related to development. If you think about a desert landscape with less human influence, there are very limited food resources, limited water resources. For nesting, ravens are kind of limited to nesting on the cliff sides. And you develop a town and you now have resources from landfills, dumpsters, residential garbage, roadkill, all these new artificial water sources with reservoirs, ponds, sewage ponds. And then all of this new nesting substrate, you have all these planted trees, power lines, buildings. And so we call all of these human resources subsidies. And so the carrying capacity of this region really isn't even related to the desert landscape anymore, because they don't even have to rely on that anymore because of all of the human provided subsidies. And I'm emphasizing subsidies because I'm just going to kind of use that word as a catch-all for these human resources for the rest of this. And so ever since the listing, ravens have been cited as an issue, but it really wasn't until about 2015 where they started to document that this is a problem in Washington County. And so they had to establish some data. And in 2015, just the HCP county biologists started, when they were out doing other activities, started documenting desert tortoise carcasses that were closely associated with raven predation. And so by 2021, they documented over 40 carcasses, which probably doesn't sound like a lot, but that is definitely an underrepresentation of how much this is happening. At that time, they were also documenting raven nests in or near the reserve. By 2020, they documented 53 of them. And then in 2021 is where they really started to actually do studies. And in partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they designed some studies where they were able to estimate the chance that an individual tortoise has of being preyed on by a raven on an annual basis. And the way they study this is actually pretty cool. They use these 3D printed tortoise shells, and they can kind of simulate with game cameras predation events. And so they found that there was an annual 18.4% chance of a tortoise between the age of 0 and 10 being eaten by a raven each year. And other studies have found that that threshold for what's sustainable is 7.8%. So we're way above that. And then the next year they did more, another study to track raven density. And they estimated that there are 2.7 ravens per kilometer square. Other studies have shown that the sustainable threshold is 0.83. So we're way above that too. And so it was with all of that data that they were able to establish that there's an issue here. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service assembled a working team to try to address the issue. And so this working team is made up of federal, state, and local agencies. So there are a few different Fish and Wildlife offices, also the Bureau of Land Management, Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and then of course, Washington County. And because of all the context with that proposed highway that I was talking about, it's a huge accomplishment in itself that this group even gets together to talk. But this group was tasked with figuring out what to do. And there are lots of raven management tools out there. I won't spend a lot of time on these, but you can reduce the subsidies. You can do different things to haze the ravens away from areas using loud noises or lasers, scarecrows. You can use different nesting deterrents. I thought this picture was pretty funny because the raven clearly doesn't care about the spikes. And so these hazing and nesting deterrents are really typically not that effective because ravens are highly intelligent and adaptable. But you can also trap and relocate them, remove nests, and then there are the more lethal management options with egg oiling, which I'll explain a little bit more on my next slide. Old-fashioned shooting and poisoning. But a little more explanation about egg oiling. So this is a management tool where basically technicians go out, remove eggs from nests and dip them in a food grade vegetable oil basically, and then put it back in the nest. And what that does is it blocks the oxygen exchange of the egg and will halt the growth of the egg. To be blunt, it kills the egg. And this can be used as a population control, but realistically, to put a dent in the raven populations, you would have to oil so many like hundreds of eggs every year and do other lethal management to really make a difference in the raven populations, which is, for one, kind of impractical. But there are other reasons to oil. So when ravens nest successfully and those eggs hatch, the adults go into this kind of hyper predation state. And anything within 1.7 kilometers of that active nest has a really high chance of being preyed on. And so this becomes a problem where ravens are nesting in critical tortoise habitat. But if you strategize where you do your oiling in these critical areas, you don't have to oil as many nests. And the idea is that that will influence the ravens to nest elsewhere. And so the idea is to move them out of these critical areas. And so this is more cost effective than other lethal strategies and a lot less socially divisive. So might have guessed this is what they ultimately decided to do. US Fish and Wildlife Service issued a migratory bird depredation permit, which authorized the oiling of up to 25 raven nests. And then in 2024, right before I started working on this in April, the county staff did a pilot project where they ended up oiling 12 nests, which totaled 64 eggs. That probably doesn't sound like a lot, but again, they were strategizing where they were doing this. So that's kind of the background on everything that went on before I started working on this. Well, not everything, but summary. And so when I joined the project, I kind of tried to address these two big questions of, what do we do next? What information, if we're going to be doing annual raven management work, what information should we be collecting and reporting out each year? And then the much bigger question is, what is the long-term management strategy? Egg oiling is not intended to be a long-term strategy. And so one of my early tasks was to create this reporting template for the county to use. And so I collaborated with a biologist at the Desert Tortoise Recovery Office. It's a US Fish and Wildlife office based in California. And I worked with them to see what information they're reporting out with some of the raven work that they're doing out there and figure out what we should be tracking year to year, both to compare from year to year in the county, but also just contribute to this greater knowledge of raven management. And it was with them that kind of created a checklist of items that we needed. This was the county that was going to be writing these reports. So I brought those ideas to them and got their input, and then ultimately created a template for annual reporting. And this will just standardize what information is being reported. And the county is actually using that template right now for their 2024 report, and they are hoping to get that published in a journal. And I wanted to contribute to this reporting, so I made a series of maps for them. I won't go into all the details of this, but might as well show a couple of these. This map shows is a heat map of the raven density, and I think it's interesting. You can see that there's a really high density of ravens right by the landfill, which is a major subsidy source. And then also created some maps from their nest or from their oiling efforts. And so you can see Most of the oiling they did is right by the reserve, and near the landfill. And so creating these maps and this reporting template kind of serve two purposes. One, these are things that just needed to be done by somebody, but it also kind of started to establish a working relationship between myself and these county partners, and kind of contributed to trying to improve the relationship between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the county. And I would go on to work with these folks a lot more throughout the summer. So that was kind of the early phase of my project. But the next part is a lot more complicated, and that's answering the question of what is the long-term management strategy? So to answer this question, I conducted interviews with the members of that working team. And before doing that, Danielle and I, we kind of followed a process that we learned in our methods class, first establishing what our interview objectives were, figuring out what we wanted to learn from these interviews. And so the four that we came up with was to identify stakeholders for engagement, identify measures of success, identify priorities besides egg oiling, and potential barriers to success. These are all critical components of an adaptive management strategy. And then designed a whole interview guide where these objectives are linked to questions. I was able to coordinate interviews with 7 out of the 9 working team members. I did these interviews virtually over Teams, each one lasting about an hour, recorded and transcribed them. And then I went through a process of qualitative analysis. Involved reading through all of the transcripts and iteratively identified 10 themes and 30 sub-themes. Went through a couple hundred pages of transcripts and coded all of the interviews. And just the very high level interview findings was that there's definitely division within this group. But they were overall aligned on this overarching goal that whatever we do with the ravens, the goal here is to support the recovery of the Mojave Desert tortoise. And people really emphasized that they didn't want to just do these things willy-nilly. They wanted science to guide these decisions and have specified metrics to trigger different management decisions. And so there was a lot of agreement there, but things really got fuzzy when it came to having a plan for how do we actually measure success and what are our priorities outside of egg oiling. And so this really established a need to help this group come to an agreement on especially the measures of success and priorities, so that we can come up with a more comprehensive management plan. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into some of the interview findings. So for measures of success, people identified a whole bunch of different metrics. People had all kinds of ideas. And I won't dive into each of these, but the emerging, where I saw the most overlap in what people thought it was really important to look at raven density, look back at the tortoise population demographics, look at percent occupied nesting territories, and the tortoise survivorship. That's where I saw the most overlap. And so in my reporting, I dove into those metrics more and provided and looked for literature support for each of these. And then the priorities were even more complicated. I don't know how easy it is to see this, but people threw out all kinds of ideas. I kind of broadly categorized a bunch of these things as subsidy reduction, but people talked about different things we could be doing at the landfill, using lasers or covering the landfill with soil. People talked about different ways to secure residential garbage using latching mechanisms, different ways to clean up roadkill. people talked about different education programs they'd like to see, and a lot of people brought up different data that they would like to track and continue monitoring. That feeds back into this goal of using science to guide management decisions. So ultimately, kind of narrowed this down to subsidy reduction, education, and continued monitoring. And so the next kind of big question was how do we fit all of this into an actual strategy? And so what I attempted to do was look for where there was agreement and put all of that on paper and created a management framework that is, I'll just show it real quick. So I created this model. I will walk through it and explain it. But the point here is I've taken the input of this group. I have literature to back this up. And this is not intended for me to come back to this group and say, I solved the problem for you. This is more just an organization of a lot of people's thoughts. And the intent here is that this group now has something that they can look at and modify. But I will just quickly walk through it. This cycles once a year. It's convenient that ravens only nest once a year, so it makes sense to do this annually. And the first thing you do early in the year is you estimate raven density, conflict level, and percent occupied nesting territories. Those are all measures of success that the group identified. And then you kind of have two decision points. You first ask, is raven density above that threshold of 0.89 ravens per kilometer squared and the conflict above the threshold of 7.8? If no, you don't really have a problem and there is limited action required. That's where I hope we are headed. But right now, the answer to that question is yes. And the next is you ask, are there occupied nesting territories within a 2-kilometer buffer of the reserve? If the answer is no, then your oiling efforts have probably had some success and you can focus efforts on subsidy reduction and education and outreach. But right now the answer is yes. And so there is a multi-pronged approach to strategically oil active nests within that buffer and do subsidy reduction. And then at the end of the year, you go back to those measures of success and ask, is percent occupied nesting territories increasing year to year? Is conflict decreasing? Are subsidies reducing? Are we seeing change in juvenile desert tortoise recruitment? And adjust for next year. Again, this is not the end product of where they're going, but this organizes a lot of ideas into one place. Here's just a visual with a 2-kilometer buffer and the raven nests. In red is the federally owned BLM land within the reserve. A short-term priority is to get approval to oil in that area. Right now, they don't have approval and they would have to go through this process called NEPA, which can take several years. So that's a short-term priority. What we don't want to see happen is we oil in the areas where it's authorized and then the ravens just go up to where their nests can't be oiled. And so I think in the model, the emphasis is really on subsidy reduction, but subsidy reduction is still a big puzzle. It's really important to address subsidy reduction because it addresses the root cause of the issue. An analogy I really like that one of the biologists I worked with used a lot is to do this oiling or other things that address the ravens, you're kind of mopping up a leaky faucet with a towel, but until you do something about the leaky faucet, you're not really addressing your problem. And so I would go as far as to say it's unethical to ignore the subsidy piece of this. But subsidy reduction is still just a huge challenge. There are endless sources of subsidies. to address each of those subsidies, you need different approaches. The way you measure success of those will be different for each. We know that the landfill is a huge attractant, but we don't really have a lot of data on what other subsidy sources the Ravens are utilizing the most. Like I mentioned, with those management tools, Ravens are highly adaptable to different interventions. I think potentially the biggest challenge here is that subsidy reduction will require changes in human behavior, which is always a challenge. And there is endless literature establishing that subsidies are important. You have to do something about subsidies, but there's really limited case studies on actual success stories of how different areas have successfully reduced subsidies. And so because there's still a lot of question marks around what to do about subsidy reduction, I kind of put forth this idea of using an adaptive management cycle to address subsidies. I don't think this is a groundbreaking model or anything, but I just wanted to kind of provide an example of how you can use adaptive management to address a single subsidy. And so I used the landfill as an example. You can assess the problem. We know we have lots of ravens in this area. It's really close to the reserve, but also maybe the landfill managers don't feel like it's their responsibility to put a lot of time and money into fixing this. And so you can design an intervention. Something that a lot of people talked about in the interviews as a potential solution at the landfill is installing these high-powered lasers that follow kind of this pre-programmed path. It doesn't hurt the ravens, but they don't like the lasers. And there is some evidence that that works in other areas, especially with agriculture. And another idea that was proposed is to get around the issue of maybe the landfill managers not feeling like it's their responsibility to pay for this. Maybe some of these agencies can just come together and fund it for the dumps. And then after you implement, monitor, see what's working, what's not working, evaluate and adjust. And so I think the unfortunate reality is that these groups do just need to embrace some risk to figure out how to reduce subsidies, which is always a challenge. I think, especially with government and conservation, just the budgets for this are already so limited. So it's tough that there's not a lot of case studies to look at to kind of justify trying some things, but you have to do something. And so out of all of this, I produced a report where I talked about the findings from the interviews. In my reporting, I was really not trying to highlight how, like, the areas of disagreement. I was more kind of highlighting those areas of agreement, because the goal of this is to help the group make some decisions, kind of push this forward. And so what's next? Just last week, I presented all of this internally to some of the Fish and Wildlife Service partners at a couple different offices, and they're pleased with what we have so far. And so soon I'll be sending that report to this working group, and we'll see what they think of my reporting there. And then it'll probably be early next year that I'll be presenting to that group. But really just the next step is to get this group together again to talk about this model. And I'm sure people will have opinions on it. But the idea there is just to get this conversation going and progress things forward. And just a little reflection on the project. I think this was a really interesting, this project is an interesting case study in how you balance conservation goals of biodiversity. You know, you have this really sensitive species, the Mojave desert tortoise. The raven is also a protected species. It's not as sensitive, but it is also native to the area. And then you have these interesting human dimensions. And I will say that I felt pretty conflicted about the use of egg oiling as a management tool for a good part of this project. I try to take kind of a nuanced stance on it. And I think part of what made me feel really conflicted about it initially was I had kind of this assumption that the adult ravens would be really distressed when their nests failed. I was kind of basing that assumption on my own experiences with wildlife rehab and seeing the way that birds react when they see, the death of their mate. And so I felt conflicted about this. It may sound silly, but I was concerned about the emotional capacity of this really intelligent animal. And I think so I looked a lot into this to try to understand how the ravens react to this. And this really hasn't been well studied, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that that birds in general react very differently to a dead mate than to just a failed nest or failed egg. I think eggs fail naturally for a variety of reasons. And so I think because there's such an immediate need, if we want to see desert tortoises in the future, I think it's a necessary step to do, at least in the short term. But of course, people will have different values around that. And so I think that's really why it's important that this is a collaborative process. It shouldn't be just me saying what to do. It shouldn't just be the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it shouldn't just be the county saying what to do. Yeah, and I guess this project allowed me to apply a lot from this program. My methodology for the interviews and that qualitative analysis were straight out of one of our methods courses, and the adaptive management piece of everything. And I see endless potential for future projects here. If Dawson holds me back for another year, I think I would do a whole project on the community engagement piece and the subsidy reduction piece. I really got to see the side of how these different government agencies work together and what that looks like. But there's so much to be done on more the human dimension side of this community piece. So that's all I have.